unsullied by us humans, sex is a very good part of human life.
We live our lives in a great deal of hypocrisy, telling our children to do one thing while we do something else.
The quest for control. We all would love it if our lives were a bit more controllable.
Discussions within the Christian community about these questions will be primary for the survival of the Christian community.
Well, you know, at this conference we've heard about contraception, cloning, surrogacy, abortion, sterility. I want to talk to you about that important aspect of humanity, which is really underlying all of this, and that is sexuality. University of Chicago researchers, Dr. Michaels and his co-authors of the book Sex in America stated, America has a message about sex, and that message is none too subtle. Anyone who watches a movie, reads a magazine, or turns on television has seen it. It says that almost everyone but you is having endless, fascinating, and varied sex. The obvious question for us is, what kind of guidance can we provide our society to help us out of this sexual wilderness? You know, this is no academic issue for me, because I left a fascinating practice of obstetrics and gynecology and reproductive medicine, and as a matter of fact did in vitro fertilization in a program that I helped start in 1984. But I left that practice about 2.5 years ago to help answer this question of how do we lead our society out of this wilderness that we find ourselves in. And as a matter of fact, one of the people that urged me to leave my practice is going to be leading this discussion after I get through, Dr. Reed Bell, who walked up to me 3 years ago and said, Joe, you need to leave your practice to do this full time. I said, thanks a lot, Reed. You leave your own practice, because I was happy as I could be doing what I was doing, but I couldn't do it anymore when I was challenged with these issues that I'm talking about today. As Nigel Cameron said yesterday, we can look at the past to understand the present, and I really agree with what he said. And so I think in this area it would be useful for us just for a few minutes to look at the past, to see why we're here, it's what started this sexual revolution of the 1960s. And as we look at the thought about sexuality of centuries past, it's clear that opposing philosophies have shaped our culture's attitudes of today. These opposing philosophies have been vying for dominance not just in culture but also in individuals' lives almost from the beginning. On the one hand is the perception of sex that existed in the perfection of the Garden of Eden, and I'd like to follow that stream of thought just for a minute, and most of you are familiar with this, but the message God gave and still gives about sex is that unsullied by us humans, sex is a very good part of human life. It's a special gift from Him, but like all of His gifts, it must be used within certain guidelines in order for humans to enjoy its benefits, and we know that. However, if we don't use it within those guidelines, it can cause much pain and heartache. So let's briefly look at this perspective on sexuality down through the centuries. You know, at creation, we read in scriptures, the man and his wife were both naked and felt no shame, a healthy sexual attitude. 1,000 years before Christ, we hear these words in the Song of Solomon, don't we? I have come into my garden, my sister, my bride. I've gathered my myrrh with my spice, joyful, exuberant, healthy sexuality. Christ said, for this reason a man shall leave his mother and father and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Therefore, they are no longer two, but one. Again, healthy sexuality. Puritans, a people of great faith living primarily in the 17th century, were described by Gottlieb when he described them as saying, Puritan writers in particular praised the delights of married love. Marriage and love naturally went together. So we see this flow of healthy sex. And finally, in 1997, Christianity Today, in an article called Reclaiming the Christian Sexual Ethic, said, our good news sexually begins with Eden. God made us so that we're sexual, so that our sexuality is a joy and a privilege, and so that we can enjoy communion between male and female. Many of us have experienced this kind of healthy sexuality in the sexual exclusivity of our marriages, haven't we? We have no sexually transmitted disease. We have no other children to support. This type of traditional sexual morality has been dominant in our culture in the past, up until the 60s. Strands of this morality still exist, but certainly only as outposts in a culture gone sexually mad today. But then there's that opposite stream of thought that we're all familiar with, and this other stream, as you might guess, began and was first described in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve's healthy natural union fell apart. Their decision to pursue their own way, assuming they could follow that path without penalty, with the inception of a different philosophy, was the inception of a different philosophy about sexuality. We could follow the impact of this line of thought through the centuries, through David and Bathsheba, and to the debauchery of the Roman Empire, but we really don't have time for all of that. And so I'll just pick it up in the 19th century. But I think there's some really interesting things that we can learn from this as we think about it. Thomas R. Malthus in 1812, for example, theorized that a population tended to increase at a faster rate than its means of subsistence. Now, what does that mean to us? Well, Charles Darwin in 1864 was impressed by Malthus's theory, and Darwin's theory of evolution was built in large measure based on Malthusian perspective. One of Darwin's intellectual heirs who went beyond reasonable bounds was his first cousin, Francis Galton. There's a misprint in your in the monograph in your paper, in your booklet there. Galton combined his powerful intellect with his total acceptance of Darwinianism to ultimately give birth to the eugenics movement. This movement, at least surprisingly to me, became very strong in the first 25 years of this century. It was in this fertile soil that Margaret Sanger planted her ideas as she founded the first birth control clinic in this country in 1916. Prior to opening that clinic, Sanger, who had sexual relations with various men and women, made this statement in something she wrote. She said, "The marriage bed is the most degenerating influence in the social order." And then later on, she wrote some eugenics articles. One of them was entitled "Birth Control to Create a Race of Thoroughbreds," among others that she wrote. Now, it was into this cauldron of fermenting ideas that Margaret Mead burst in 1928 with the publication of Coming of Age in Samoa. This book was published as scientific proof that unrestrained sex was not only not bad, but actually was the best sex. It received wild acceptance in America. And actually around the world. She concluded, for example, that the exceptionally smooth sex adjustment of adult Samoans is preceded by an adolescence of free lovemaking and promiscuity before marriage. Martin Orens and other anthropologists have shown that Mead, a 23-year-old graduate student who was in Samoa a total of 9 months, didn't know the language very well, published findings that were at best naive and at worst dishonest. Orens, in his book Not Even Wrong, in speaking of anthropologists' wide acceptance of Mead's work, said, "Doubtless many of us did so," in other words, accepted her work, "because we wanted such findings to be correct." And then he goes on in his book to say, because Mead's work was deemed to possess authority, it became a guide for proper child rearing and justification for sharing more sexual knowledge with children and a more permissive attitude toward childhood and adolescent sexual practice. Certainly all those who already held such views welcome Mead's validation, Orens says. So they were looking for something like she published when she was 23 years old. The Mead was at the peak of her claim in 1950. Sanger died in 1966, and about this time an unprecedented event occurred, and that was the approval by the American FDA of the first birth control pill. Now the pill allowed the possibility of Mead's unfettered sexuality and Sanger's feminine freedom to become reality. And you know, as we view all of these forces in retrospect, it's as though a number of uncoordinated lights all became collimated and laser-focused on the early 1960s, setting fire to philosophies that had been smoldering around our culture for years, giving birth to the sexual revolution. The revolution included the accusation of many of the intellectual elite that when people were taught about sexuality through a religious grid, they became sexually repressed and neurotic. It's true that, and we know this, that some Christians have mishandled the healthy message about sexuality that we've just reviewed from Scripture and from history and twisted it. But one of the benefits of the past 40 years actually has been the fact that now I think many of us, or perhaps most of us in this culture, are now able to talk about sexual issues, not just personally, but publicly in a much more open way. But the problem is that with the arrival of the sexual revolution, rather than achieving balance, we've seen a sudden, overwhelming dominance of the secular perspective of sexuality over traditional sexual morality. Free love and if it feels good, do it have become the mantras of the day, haven't they? Now, these are some of the historical events that produced our societal sexual upheaval. And you've heard Dr. Cottrell and Dr. Hager talk about some of the problems that have resulted from this cultural change. But I'd like to review just for a minute, so it'll be right at on the top of your mind. First, I'd like to say this, that in respect to the topic of this conference, the reproductive revolution, may I mention that 1/3 of women who are sterile because of sexually transmitted disease. Sexually transmitted disease is the most rapidly increasing cause of infertility in the United States today. As a matter of fact, perhaps much of our discussion about reproductive technologies that we've had these past 2 days would perhaps have been unnecessary if it were not for the sexually transmitted disease epidemic that we have going on today. And I'm convinced, and I've said this publicly many times, that a lot of in vitro fertilization programs would probably be not economically feasible or viable except for the STD problems that have made so many women sterile in our culture. In addition to that are a number of other things, and David Hager mentioned a few of these yesterday, but a recent study in the New England Journal of Medicine last October said that 45.9% of all African Americans above the age of 11 have evidence of herpes 2 infection. In addition to that, there's been a 500% increase in the infection of white teens in America with herpes over the past decade and a half. A recent study at Rutgers, and David mentioned this, has shown over a 3-year period that 60% of the sexually active co-eds were infected with human papilloma virus. What he didn't mention was that HPV causes more than 93% of all truly abnormal pap smears and cancer of the cervix. In addition to this, we find that almost as many Americans have died of AIDS as Americans who died in World War II, about 400,000. We could go on and on with this. For example, 20% of sexually active teens will get a new sexually transmitted disease every year. Another part of this epidemic is the non-marital pregnancy problem, and I'm just going to mention a few statistics on that just again to remind you how bad this all is. 7 out of 10 teen moms never finish high school. The long-term wage earning power of teen fathers is greatly reduced. The teenage sons of adolescent moms are 2.7 times more likely to end up in prison. We're spending $1 billion a year in America building and maintaining prison cells just for the proportion of prisoners who come from these teen homes. The teenage daughters of adolescent moms are 50% more likely to bear children out of wedlock. We could go on and on with this. In addition, of course, to these physical problems, the emotional and spiritual damage that occurs is happening to so many in our culture. These are staggering epidemics. They're hurting hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the United States and around the world. There are students of culture that feel that these are the 2 biggest problems we have in American society today, and I certainly agree with them. So what do we do? Well, I became intensely involved in this issue when I realized that it is in the very nature of these epidemics themselves that we find keys, find tips to their solution. Let me explain. These epidemics, as we've just looked at, are destroying the lives of millions of people in the United States and around the world. These are medical problems. Certainly they have other implications too, but they certainly are medical problems. Because they're medical problems, their prevalence and their impact can be measured. We have to guess about the impact of, for example, media's impact on teenagers. We don't have to guess about the impact of these diseases and these pregnancies. We can measure it. We can know how bad it is. We can also measure the attempts to solve them. Are the attempts working? We can measure whether they're working or not. Are the number of adolescents infected with STD or pregnancy out of wedlock decreasing dramatically as a result of various interventions, or are they not decreasing? Then communication, society-wide communication of the severity of these problems and the information about attempts that have either failed or been successful is the next step in helping to solve the problem society-wide. I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit right here, I think, but maybe not. What group should not only describe these problems but take the lead in guiding our society to health? Well, I think we medical people know how to work with measurable medical problems. That's what we do. Because of our training and our ability, we carry the responsibility for active participation in efforts to solve these things. It's not primarily up to the government. It's not primarily up to the educators. It's not up to the media. Leadership in solving these problems is up to you and me, we who are a part of the medical community. Now, this isn't to remove the responsibility from the rest of you, John, and the rest of the people here who are not medical people. But I think that in a special way, the responsibility is up to the medical people who have the unique opportunity in this society to break the trail with the data, with the medical data that can say so much about what we need to do for our children. So what do we do? What do we do to educate our society? Well, you might guess I have some ideas. I think first that I think we all need to invest the time and the attention to learn about the problems, how bad they are. Some of this data I just gave you, some that Dr. Hager gave you, some that Dr. Cottrell mentioned. Our organization is a medical educational organization, and we have the data, and we're collecting it more and more, and we'll be glad to help you have this so you can go home and tell the people you work with about these problems because they are this bad. We need to learn who's being hurt the most. The people that are being hurt the most, if you were listening to Dr. Hager, are teenagers. They are physically more susceptible to these problems, and they get involved in risky sexual practices more than older people do. And they bear the brunt of this epidemic. We need to understand the incredible impact of the $25 million ADD study funded by Congress, which was reported, the first report from this massive data bank was reported September the 10th, 1997 in Journal of the American Medical Association. This was the largest study ever done on adolescents. I cannot tell you the impact of this study. It is blowing the minds of people who deal with adolescents. And you know what it's saying, and what's so astounding to people, even the people that did it, Blum and Resnick, is that what it showed is that for children that are avoiding risky behavior, above every other factor in their lives that was protective to them was a good connectedness to their parents. And the people, even the ones that did the study, find that almost hard to believe. So what we need to do is tell parents how strong their impact is on kids' lives. One other thing, and that is that even above parents in the sexual area, was the fact that if kids had taken a pledge of abstinence, above everything else, that was the most protective thing for them in avoiding sexual practice. And now this study was a study in the homes of 12,000 kids. It really represents all teens in America. 15% of girls in this study and 10% of boys in this study had taken a pledge of abstinence. That means probably 15% of girls in American society and 10% of boys have taken a pledge. Above everything else, this protected them from getting involved sexually. So let's guide our children to take such a pledge. Let's go home and encourage supportive programs like True Love Waits. Why would all parents not give guidance to their kids? Well, it's clear that many parents have accepted the idea that their influence on their teenagers is unimportant. As a matter of fact, almost they think that if they tell their kids to do one thing, the kids are going to do something else. And so because of this, they basically just abandon telling their kids anything. The young people don't know what their parents think that they ought to do. We who are called to educate our culture, our society, need to first educate our parents that the most powerful influence in kids' lives, above MTV, above their peers, above their teachers, above everything else, are they, the parents. And we need to encourage them to get involved in that. We can do that. We can help educate our parents through our churches, through public meetings, through our involvement with them in other places. Our medical offices, we as physicians and nurses and those involved medically can help to say to parents when we're involved with them that they can impact their children. We can write op-ed pieces, we can write newspaper articles, and I encourage you to get involved in doing that. As a matter of fact, as much as you want us to, we can help you with the data and information to know what to say in those things. So give us a call. Next, we need to teach parents, educators, youth leaders, and others who love children that risky behavior is a syndrome. We must not think that we can be successful with young people to come to them and say, stop smoking, if we don't also tell them, stop drinking and stop doing sex. Because if a teen is involved with cigarettes, they're more likely going to be doing drugs. If they're into drugs, they're more likely to be doing sex. So we must encourage kids to avoid all risky behavior if we hope to be successful with any of the risky behaviors. And we have the data. Dr. Ower at the University of Indiana, among others, has shown clearly that this is a syndrome of risky behavior for kids. We can't just approach and attack one of those things. In his book, Johnny Can't Tell Right from Wrong, and we've had it out there at our booth, Bill Kilpatrick says that we must help young people develop strong values and character. He says you can't just come to me and say, Bill, I've worked it out for you to run the Boston Marathon. We've paid the fee, you can go do it. If I haven't worked up the physical foundation for running the Boston Marathon, I can't do it. It's a dishonest offer to me. In the same way, we can't come to children, young people, and tell them that they need to be abstinent from sex or drugs or anything else unless we've built into them the foundation of character and values that enable them to avoid these risky behaviors. So we need to help young people with this. And obviously from this last comment, you would know that I would say that Just Say No programs for almost all young people don't work. It's going to take more than that. A young person's ability to say no to any of the risky behaviors must be based on the foundation of strong character and values. And knowing this, we can use our influence in our schools, in our churches, and in other places to produce. What I'd advocate is long-term, in the children's lives at least, character and sexuality education programs for them. Not just short-term, come in and give them a lecture or two and then leave them. It's not going to be very successful if that's all we do. Okay, one other thing, and I think we need to understand the condom issue. You see, condoms are not the issue. That is the condom issue. The fundamental question is what will increase the chance that the young person will grow up with the most healthy and happy life. That's what we want for them. This is why the issue is not condoms. The issue is elimination of risk, not reduction of risk. And all condoms ever do in kids' lives or anybody else's life is just reduce the risk for some diseases some of the time. And for pregnancy, just some of the time too. Condoms provide almost no protection against the most common sexually transmitted disease, human papillomavirus, which causes almost all cervical cancer, which is killing 5,000 women a year in the United States alone. Condoms provide almost no protection for a girl's fertility, or at least very unreliable protection for it. Condoms obviously don't protect the heart. More than that, there's not a single sex ed program in the country that's a safer sex program that says young people should use condoms, not one of them, that has dramatically lowered sexually transmitted disease or pregnancy rates among teenagers, not any. And we have the data on that too. But still, even if condoms were more successful, more effective, if more young people use them, it still wouldn't keep them from getting hurt physically, many of them from getting hurt physically and emotionally by sex. Again, medical people, educators, in fact, all of us need to be particularly attentive to the issue of secondary virginity. And you say, why? Well, you know, the attitude today is that if young people have become, or older single people have become involved in sex, there's nothing we can do. All we can do is give them birth control pills and teach them how to use their condoms. There's just no hope for them. But you know, data clearly show that if young people are sexually active and not married, they will probably increase the number of sexual partners they have over a lifetime. As a matter of fact, Sex in America, the book by Michaels from the University of Chicago, made the statement that the reason that people now have more sexual partners over their lifetime is that they're spending a longer period sexually active but unmarried. And the data clearly shows, and Hager said this yesterday, that the biggest risk you or I or anybody else has for sexually transmitted disease is how many sexual partners we've had in our lifetime. So if we accept the fact that single people who are having sex are just going to keep doing it, we know from the study at University of Chicago that they're going to keep having more and more sexual partners, almost all of them will, and that is increasing dramatically their chance of having sexually transmitted disease. So the imperative, therefore, for us all, medical people, but everybody else, is for us to educate our community that they must guide their young people back to a sexually abstinent lifestyle, even if they've been involved in sex in the past. If we care about them, if we care about their not getting these diseases and not getting pregnancies. And we in our offices, by the way, we who are medical people seeing these people in our offices, in my opinion, just must not just hand them their contraceptives. If we do that, and that's a personal choice by the practitioner, we must at least say, now, if you keep having sex, you're going to probably have more partners. You need to stop, because the more partners you have, the more risk of disease and pregnancy. And most medical personnel in this country are not doing that. We can teach the truth about marriage. Dr. Self, thank you so much for your emphasis on marriage in this secular society, but we can talk about marriage in this secular society. Marriage as the environment for sexual activity should be advocated for. This is the sexual environment in which people are most likely going to avoid disease and non-marital pregnancy. Sex in America, the Chicago study again says that marriage, we find, regulates sexual behavior with remarkable precision. No matter what they did before they wed, no matter how many partners they had, the sexual lives of married people are similar. Despite the popular myth that there's a great deal of adultery in marriage, our data and other reliable studies do not find it. Instead, a vast majority are faithful while the marriage is intact. You know, that's sort of good news from some secular researchers. Most sex educators say that they want to give full information about sex and sexuality, don't they? They'll tell us that. We think kids should have full information about sexual issues, but many of those same educators will not talk about marriage. Now, what I say is, since the majority of sex goes on in marriage in the United States, then if we don't tell kids about marriage, we're withholding sexual information from them, aren't we? Okay? So I think we should ask those educators, why are you afraid to talk about marriage when you talk about sex to young people? Full, honest education demands that marriage be discussed, including its benefits. Faith is important for young people in avoiding risky behavior. The ADD study, the big study I was just talking about, and a number of other research reports show this, that faith is important to kids. The ADD study, for example, said this: those who ascribed importance to religion and prayer tended to have a later age of sexual debut and were less likely to use substances. This is consistent with other studies of risk and protective factors that link religiosity, spirituality, and religious identity with conventional behaviors. So religion does protect kids. Many kids take their faith quite seriously. But let me say just a little bit more about sex education in the church. You heard David Hager yesterday and his disappointment about churches not doing more, and he and I have talked about this, and we both agree that it's been a disappointment we've had. I believe most people in churches are a little naive about their children. We say about our children that they're Christians, and I'm a Christian, we've had them in the church, and so I know they're doing the right thing. You know, unfortunately, the studies show that children in evangelical churches are just about as sexually active as their friends who are not in churches. Further than that is that data clearly shows that most parents have not told their children what they should or should not do. Okay? Deuteronomy 11:19 says for us to teach our children when we get up in the morning, when we go to bed at night, when we walk in the way, bore them to death, teaching them. But it's not saying just teach them about Yahweh. It's not this sort of pie in the sky about God. It says teach them, and it's talking about teaching them the law, isn't it? What to do and what not to do. And believe me, our kids today, even in our finest churches and from some of our finest parents, don't know what we think they should do. The church is an ideal place to teach sexuality and values to the next generation and to support parents in their efforts also. Perhaps you can encourage your church in this endeavor when you get back home. And again, we have some ideas that might help you with that. Feel free to call us at our office if you want to. Okay. Effective education is using this information at every opportunity God may lead you, and I hope He does, to be active in your children's schools, in your local or state government, in your medical or professional organizations, or you may want to influence your local or national media. It may be your church or your local CPC, these groups that you work with. But I'll tell you this, one of these groups desperately needs your help to impact their children, the children in your community. The Medical Institute for Sexual Health is, our organization is not a grassroots organization. One of our reasons for being is to help you make this information known effectively. You can call us for material, you can call us for data, you can call us if you're preparing a talk. Let me give you one example. We had a lady physician in Dallas who was in one of the well-known school districts there who got concerned about the sex ed going on in that school district, and she invited a couple of friends over, and they looked at some of the materials that we'd provided her, and they were so impacted by it with some of the stuff I've just told you that they invited some more friends. Before long, they had 100 moms who went to the school district and changed the sex education going on in that community. So it can happen. You know, in my opinion, it's imperative that we help our young people, and indeed our entire society, understand that sex is like fire. Fire's a good thing. It can cook our food. It can keep us warm. It can keep us from dying if it's real cold outside. We never used it for that purpose in Austin, Texas, believe me. But it can be a good thing, but it also can be a very bad thing. If a patient whose cooktop on their sailboat blew up and threw fuel on them, if they hadn't gotten in the lake, they would have burned to death. They still bear scar on their bodies. Well, is fire good or fire bad? Well, fire is as it's used. And we know that sex is very much the same way. It must be handled appropriately. In the right context, sex is a wonderful gift from God. It allows true intimacy in a context of fidelity. It also allows procreation in an environment that allows children to grow up healthy, the way we'd like for them to do, or at least with more chance of good health. It provides stability for a culture. In addition, and most important of all, it brings activity of humans in one of the most important areas of life into harmony with God's will and purpose. There was an epidemic many years ago, the enormous scope of which reminds me of the problems of STD and non-marital pregnancy we're seeing in our culture today. Medicine failed to protect humanity for many years from this epidemic, although the solution to the problems were literally at hand. We've probably all heard of Dr. Ignatius Semmelweis. He practiced in the last century in a maternity hospital. The maternal death rate in the hospital in which he practiced was 20%. He found that if he merely had his physicians wash their hands in a mildly antiseptic solution, the death rate plummeted to 4%. Dr. Semmelweis was on the wrong side both in medical and political politics, and because of that, for his entire life, he was incapable of getting his message out to a society where hundreds of thousands of women were dying. He spent the rest of his life trying to get his message out, actually dying in an insane asylum, still not being heard, still trying to proclaim the message to the answer to the problem, an answer that today we accept as merely common sense. Semmelweis did not have the tools available to him that we have today. He didn't have the ability to gather data from all over the United States. He didn't have the communication systems we have today. He couldn't publish like we can. We have these things, but do we have the heart and courage of a Semmelweis who saw the suffering of these hundreds of thousands of women and their families and was willing to cry out for the rest of his life? I believe we have the responsibility given to us by God Himself to love the people of the nation and the people of the world and to have this passion for them.